After back-to-back years of having excellent starting quarterbacks, Washington State is on to their third quarterback in 3 years because they can't keep them from entering the transfer portal. 2 years ago, it was Cam Ward who transferred to Miami. This last season, John Montier left the program for Oklahoma after having an incredible season. And Zebi Eckhouse, the starting quarterback for Washington State this season, also entered the transfer portal, but he changed his mind and came back to the program for his redshirt senior season, hoping to lead them to a very solid year and continue the tradition of very solid Washington State quarterbacks. And he'll start off the season against FCS Idaho, a team that is pretty solid in the FCS level, but probably not going to compare very much to this Washington State team, although many of these Washington State players are actually transfers from South Dakota State, an FCS school in the same region as Idaho. I do think that they're going to take a little while to adapt to the FBS level, but starting the year against Idaho is going to be a pretty easy way to do it. I do like Washington State here specifically because of the senior quarterback experience that Zevi Eckhouse has.
And even though they have a lot of those transfers coming from South Dakota State, and it might take a little bit for them to adjust to the FBS level, it's not going to be an adjustment to a system because the head coach for Washington State this season is Jimmy Rogers, the former head coach from South Dakota State, who finished his career at South Dakota State in just 2 seasons, going 27-3, including a national championship in his very first season as their head coach. So I think with those transfers coming in, particularly on defense, this is going to be a pretty solid Washington State team. Against San Diego State in week two, San Diego State was not very good last year, and I don't think they will get very much better. And once again, with a senior quarterback, we're going to lean that way, especially at home too. Offensively as well, even though Washington State has to bring in a couple new wide receivers and a new running back after Wayshawn Parker left in the transfer portal to go to Utah after a very solid freshman season. The two running backs coming in, guess what? They're from South Dakota State. So I think with Jimmy Rogers as their head coach, they will do just fine and take some pressure off of Zevi Eckhouse in his first couple starts as the Washington State quarterback for this season. So they should get a win over San Diego State. And in their first road game of the year against North Texas, I think they should also get a win. North Texas might have been a little bit more dangerous of a team last season when they had Chandler Morris as their starting quarterback, but he entered the transfer portal and is now at Virginia, and he was a big focal point of their offense. So North Texas is going to be a little bit worse this season, but it is a road game and a bit of a road trip for the Cougars here. So not totally like 100% chance of any kind, but should be a game they definitely win. So Washington State moves to 3-0 before the Apple Cup.
And that game, I do believe, is going to be very difficult. Washington is a team that we are very high on in the Big Ten. They have a young quarterback in Demond Williams who has a lot of talent and is very promising. I think they're going to have a very, very solid offense. Just overall, this is a very underrated Washington team. The defense also going to be very solid, and they have an extremely good home field advantage, even though that won't come into play this game. I do think this is going to be a really tough Washington team to beat. It's a great rivalry here. Unfortunately, we're not sure how long it's going to be able to continue due to both teams no longer being in the Pac-12. I think that in potentially one of the final iterations of the Apple Cup, the Washington Huskies will get the win and give Washington State their first loss of the season. This is one of those games that early on in the season, I do think is going to affect a lot of these South Dakota State transfers, really adapting to the FBS level by playing a Big Ten team this early on in the year is just not going to be very easy.
But I do think this can be a competitive game considering Washington State actually won this game last year. And even 2 years ago when Washington made that run in the college football playoffs, it was a close win for Washington there. So this game is one of the more competitive rivalry games. So I wouldn't be surprised if Washington State can pull off an upset, but Washington does seem like the more complete team, especially with the return of Jonah Coleman in the backfield. Following week is another road trip, this time to Colorado State, and the Rams are going to be an interesting team next year because they have Braden Fowler Nicolosi returning as their starting quarterback, and he's been very solid for the past few seasons. But a big part of his success has been having a very strong wide receiver room, and most of those guys have moved on, whether it was to the NFL draft or to the transfer portal. And I do think this Colorado State team can still be pretty competitive with Fowler Nicolosi, but they're not going to be as competitive as they have been in the previous seasons. And I do think Washington State will be looking for a bounce back win. And I do think they will get it against Colorado State here. Could be an interesting one, especially since it's another road game after a tough loss to Washington. But I do think this is a game where they can bounce back and get the win here. So they'll be 4-1 heading into their first bye week.
And out of that bye week, back-to-back road trips to Power Four schools. The first one in the SEC, the Ole Miss Rebels, for the first time in 4 years, will not have a starting quarterback named Jackson Dart. It's instead going to be the young guy in Austin Simmons. Now, he's a guy who has a ton of promise, and I think that he's going to be a great player for Ole Miss, but it's going to take some time. And early on in the season, I think there's going to be some growing pains, some struggles, but it's still a very solid Ole Miss team around him. You still have Lane Kiffin as the head coach, and I do think that the Rebels are going to be one of the better teams in the country, but maybe near the bottom of the top 25 this season, whereas we've seen them as a pretty consistent top 15 team years past. I think Ole Miss, though, is still a better team than Washington State. They have the home field advantage, and they will get this win, giving the Cougars their second loss of the year. Then it's a road trip to Virginia. This one, a very long trip. If they're not coming from Ole Miss straight up to Virginia, you got to go all the way back to Washington and over. Not really sure the whole logistics of it. If that's the case, that would be horrible. I think that Virginia, though, is slightly underrated. They have Chandler Morris transferring in from North Texas, who had a pretty solid season last year. And I think they're going to be a very solid team this season. We do expect Virginia to compete to make a bowl game. And I think Washington State, honestly, is probably the more talented team. But we're taking the Cavaliers to pull off this upset at home, moving the Cougars to 4-3.
And the schedule doesn't get too much easier these next two games before their final bye week. Starting off with hosting Toledo, and Toledo is one of the teams that is a front runner in the MAC for next season. After pulling off an insane six overtime win over Pitt in their bowl game to conclude their season. But this Toledo team has a lot of returning production from last season, which is why there is so much hype surrounding this team to possibly win the MAC next season. They have Tucker Gleason returning as their starting quarterback. Chip Trayanum has been bouncing around in college football for the last few seasons, but is still a very solid back. The wide receiver room is returning two of their starters from last year as well. And the defense has a lot of their starters from last season also returning. So Toledo is not going to be an easy game for this Washington State team, but it is at home after back-to-back road trips, and that is a long trip for this Toledo team to make. So could go either way here, especially if this negative momentum carries over from the back-to-back losses for the Cougars. But I think they'll get back in the win column here and beat the Rockets to move to 5-3, one game away from bowl eligibility. But if they want to get it before that bye week, their road trip to face Oregon State, the first game of the home and home series, stands in their way. And the Beavers, I think, are a little underrated this year. There's a possibility in our minds that Oregon State might be a playoff team going into next season. And it's going to be an uphill battle for them because their schedule is a little difficult and they are from the Pac-2, essentially. But they have the talent to be a really, really competitive team going into next season. That starts with bringing in Duke quarterback Malik Murphy to be their starter after another solid year. Kind of a similar situation to Washington State the past few years, Duke has had very solid quarterbacks over the last few seasons that have transferred out, but they always bring in good quarterbacks too. Like for this year, they bring in Darian Mensah from Tulane. But Oregon State has a lot of returning production as well. All of their wide receivers from last year are back. So is their starting running back in Anthony Hankerson. And the defense is the same situation. Most of the starters are returning. The key difference is Malik Murphy is that starting quarterback, and we have a lot of faith in him to really turn it up to the next level and make this Beavers team a possible playoff contender. So on the road here for Washington State, going to be a competitive game, and they get to play them another time, but for the first round, Oregon State will get the win. That will drop the Cougars to 5-4 going into their final bye week.
Out of that bye week, really not worried about this Louisiana Tech game. I just don't think that they have much on either side of the ball. Not a great transfer portal class, not enough returning production to do much. We are very confident Washington State bounces back with a win here. And then the James Madison game, going to be relatively difficult going on the road. But the Dukes do have a new starting quarterback, bringing in Matthew Sluka, the transfer quarterback from UNLV, after he was replaced by Alex Orji.
And I'm kind of surprised that he is the projected starter, considering that the starting quarterback from last season for the Dukes in Alonzo Barnett III is still on the team. But whatever they end up doing for the quarterback position, it's going to be a little bit tough for them, considering that their three starting wide receivers are all new transfers. The only thing they have going for them returning on the offensive side at a skill position is George Pettaway returning as their starting running back after a very solid season. But I do think this Dukes team, despite being competitive over the last few years, isn't going to be able to pull off a win over this Washington State team. I do think at this point in the season, Washington State will be fairly competitive and one of the better teams in the country. I think all these South Dakota State transfers will be very accustomed to this level of play and to this team. I think Washington State can get a very impressive win on the road against James Madison before their rematch with Oregon State, this time at home.
And I do think this game is going to be closer. But kind of as Connor hinted at earlier, we really like this Oregon State team. Now, saying they have the potential to make the playoffs, I want to clarify it is about a 1% chance because they have to do it as an at-large team. And the odds of that happening are very, very low. But if Malik Murphy is as good as we think he's going to be, yeah, they could potentially do it. And they would absolutely have to win this Washington State game in order for that to be a possibility. I do think that Oregon State's going to be favored despite being on the road. If they're having as good of a season as we think that they are, Washington State's going to make it close. It's really hard to beat the same team twice, but that is what we are going to predict the Beavers to do, dropping Washington State to 7-5. Now, our way too early projection was 6.8 wins. We had Washington State going 6-6. The projection has come up to 7.45 wins, and we have them going 7-5 now, as you just saw. The floor is going to be 6-6. I really don't see them doing much worse than this. I think the transfer portal class, really keeping all of those players from South Dakota State together, letting them develop under the same head coach at the next level, they're going to make a bowl game. Now, the ceiling, if everything goes perfectly, this team could potentially go 10-2. I do not see them sweeping Oregon State. I think best case scenario for the Cougars is a split of that season series, whereas we think Oregon State's just a little bit better and has the ability to sweep them. I think Washington State could, at the very, very best, could go 10-2, which would mean they would pull off a massive upset either at home against Washington or on the road against Ole Miss. Either of those would be very crazy, but it is slightly possible. So thank you guys for watching. Please make sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in our next video.